In this video, we're going to consider cycles in ecosystems, that is, how matter moves through abiotic and biotic parts of the ecosystem. Matter has to cycle because the number of atoms of matter, that's stuff, so all the elements on our planet, doesn't change. Atoms that are in air or water are taken up by plants. Animals eat those plants, using the atoms to grow, and then, as both plants and animals decompose, all the atoms are returned to the air or the water or the soil to be used again and to go round the cycle. So atoms that are in you might once have been in a dinosaur. In this video, we're going to look at carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, oxygen cycle. So we're going to consider how atoms of carbon, nitrogen and oxygen cycle through the abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem. We'll start off with the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide is found in the atmosphere, and the only thing that can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is the process of photosynthesis, which happens in plants. Plants use sunlight energy to trap the carbon atoms in molecules such as sugar and starch and fats and lots of other molecules too. And these molecules then get passed on to animals when animals eat the plants. And the animals then use those molecules with carbon in them to grow and to give them energy. Every living cell in every living thing respires all the time. That means that they release energy from molecules so that they can live. And when they do that, they're going to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So you can see there are several arrows going from the animals and the plants back to the atmosphere where carbon dioxide is found. There is another aspect of the carbon cycle which happened millions of years ago. Some plants became fossilized and some marine creatures became fossilized. The plants became coal and the marine creatures became oil. And these things are known as fossil fuels. When we burn fossil fuels in factories, power stations, in our vehicles, we actually release the carbon atoms from the fossil fuel where they're trapped back into the atmosphere to be used again by plants. Now, the carbon cycle I've shown you here is actually a very simplified version. There are more bits to the carbon cycle, which include the oceans and also rocks like limestone that hold and trap carbon in them too, and they're not included in this diagram. The next cycle we'll think about is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is an atom that is needed in living things, and its key area that it's needed for is to make proteins and to make DNA. And nitrogen can only enter living things when plants absorb it from the soil, and they absorb nitrogen in the form of nitrates. So in our diagram, nitrates are found down here in the soil. Nitrates can be added to the soil so we can increase the fertility of our soil in a few ways. And you can see the arrows going into the soil from fertilizers, so we can have man-made fertilizers. You can have natural fertilizers, and they add nitrates to the soil. You can also add nitrates to the soil using special plants, and there's a group of plants called legumes, which includes beans and peas and clover, and they can add nitrogen to the soil in the form of nitrates because they have bacteria living in their roots that trap nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil as nitrates. The third way to add nitrates is quite dramatic. It doesn't happen very often, and it's when lightning travels through the air, and oxygen and nitrogen in the air are actually superheated and they react with each other to form nitrates. So when it rains, they drop down into the soil. So we've got nitrates in the soil, and they can leave the soil. So one way is that plants take them up by their roots. That's the way we want them to leave the soil, so that our plants can grow big and strong and get eaten by an animal, which they can then use them to grow big and strong. But there are some ways in which nitrates can leave that are unhelpful, and those are associated with water, really. So leaching is when nitrates get washed into rivers or lakes, and that's what's happening over here. So we've got leaching into the lake, or leaching if you put too many fertilizers on the soil and then it rains, just washes it straight off. Or if your soil is really wet, like swampy or marshy or waterlogged, then there are some bacteria that actually eat nitrates for energy, and therefore they destroy the nitrates in the soil. And that's called denitrifying. So our last cycle that we need to consider is the oxygen cycle. This is very simple. All living things need oxygen to respire, so to release energy from food. So every living cell is using oxygen, and the only thing that can make oxygen is the plant when it's doing photosynthesis. So we've got a very simple cycle of oxygen leaving the atmosphere when it's breathed in by animals or other living things, and then re-entering the atmosphere when a plant makes it after whilst it's photosynthesizing. So those are our three main cycles of atoms of matter being reused and recycled over and over again, sometimes spending time in the abiotic part of the ecosystem, so in the atmosphere or in the water, and sometimes being part of the biotic part of the ecosystem, so inside a living plant or a living animal or inside bacteria.